All right, hey guys, welcome to the MTI podcast. Here with Rob and Kelson. Wanted to discuss some of the kind of positive and negative experiences associated with leadership or people who have influenced in the past. Not sure where we'll go with this. I have some examples of kind of broad based, and then some for my own performance, some like a case of poor leadership. So we just spent about 5 minutes trying to coach Rob on how to put his phone on mute. So now that he's all settled, let's start with you, Rob, since he didn't want to go first. Good leadership. Where have you seen it? How did it impact you?
I guess that when it comes to people I've worked with, I can't really point to a specific, general category there. Just comes from I understand that I didn't have a lot of leadership. I've been an entrepreneur for almost 30 years, so I kind of been the boss. So I'm harkening back to my Coast Guard days, and there were, I guess, some quotes from some of my supervisors I've worked with, all officers, and one was I guess the one who kind of had the most impact on me in terms of I remembering his quotes or his things he said was a commander that I had when I worked up in a district office in Juneau, Alaska, my last 3 years in the Coast Guard. He was in the AIDS navigation office, and this guy had just come from captain one of the buoy tenders, and he was head of all the AIDS navigation in the district. Don't mean to get too Coast Guard with everybody, but I was on a black hole buoy tender. I really liked that work. Anyway, one of the things he's imparted on me was the first one was inspect what you expect, and just reminded me to while you want to give employees or subordinates autonomy to do their work, you always want to check in. You have a certain expectations, and you want to touch base and check in and stay connected, make sure that that work's getting done the way you want it, and to let the employees know or your subordinates know that it has nothing to do with your trust in them. It's just being thorough on your part. And then secondly, what he had said was this idea of acknowledge effort but reward results. And he described one time on his buoy tender where they had an engineering problem that was impacting operations in the buoy tender. And at that time, the buoy tenders in the Coast Guard were World War II era buoy tenders. The one I was on was a World War II era buoy tender, and the one he was on. And so the engine rooms was these really old diesel engines, and things are going wrong on them. But they were, on the other hand, relatively simple to electronics of today. He described effort where his engineering crew was down there trying to fix the problem, and we're spending lots of time down there, and he wouldn't congratulate them on their effort. He said, I see you're working hard. He said, but why, when is it going to be fixed? And I think that's an important distinction, is that in all the things that we do, that what matters is results. A lot of times effort results in better results, but what especially matters is result. And I think that's always something to consider, is that this idea of acknowledging the effort, understand, let your subordinates know that you see that they're working hard, but don't reward them for effort, reward them for results. And I guess the final one comes from another, my captain, one of my captains on my buoy tender. And he described, he described the deck officer that he really had a lot of trust in. And this deck officer in the Navy or in the Coast Guard, for people who don't know, when you're a deck officer, you're up on the bridge, you're driving the boat, and you're responsible, for anything that happens up there. Running into somebody, running aground, et cetera, et cetera. And the captain lays out specific rules when he is supposed to be called if there's an issue up on the bridge. And as a deck officer, if one of those calls, for example, is you kind of get lost, the quartermaster can't. This happened to me. can't find where you are for whatever reason, you have to call the captain up and let him know. Or if a ship is coming, within another ship is coming a certain distance. Anyway, it's late at night, and you might be calling the captain several times and waking him up. And there's this, I guess, natural tendency not to want to call the captain and wake him up because it just wakes him up and bothers him, but also because it may show a deficiency on your part on not being able to handle the situation. But he described a petty officer who worked for him who would call him would follow the rules to the letter and would call him multiple times if anything came up. And he said that he had the most trust in this petty officer. He's a deck officer for him because unlike some of the junior officers he might hesitate to call, he knew this guy would always call. And of course, on a Navy ship or a Coast Guard ship, the captain is always responsible for everything that happens. He's inescapable. So if the ship runs aground and he's nowhere near the deck, he's still responsible and he's going to lose his job. So those are three things that kind of stand out for me in terms of leadership examples or ideas about leadership that have stuck from my Coast Guard years.
Do you have any instances of when you applied some of those within your own professional life?
Yeah, I guess I'm not a specific example. I think I guess I do have a specific example from my days when I owned a newspaper, which was I started a newspaper and then I bought another one, and it was very intense time in my 30s. I was living in the office, barely making payroll. I think one year I made $6,000 that year. Recently divorced. I was running as hard as I could just to keep my head above water. And I would have an all-nighter every Wednesday night. We went to print on Thursdays or whatever, and every Wednesday night I would have an all-nighter, or Tuesday night an all-nighter, getting everything set to go to the printer. And of course I would drive the digital file up the printer, come back anyway. And so my staff was working really hard, and I remember even people younger than I was just in my late 20s when I started, and early 30s when I was running it. I had kids working for me just out of college, young reporters and photographers and stuff. And of course they were all working really hard. It's just part of being in that business, and long hours. And I remember getting on people for not getting stuff done, and that came up, and I told them, hey, I understand you guys working hard, but working hard doesn't matter. You got to get results. So there was a couple instances of that for sure. And some employees took that well and some didn't, but that's just the reality of it's just a reality, period. That results are what matter.
I'm curious, like, between the folks who took it well and those who didn't, did you see any kind of like, what was performance after that for folks who didn't take it well? Like, did they get the message, and did they understand, or was it they're holding a grudge against you now?
Yeah, I think that what it depended on the individual. A lot of young people, get to that point in their life. You imagine just out of college, you get hired by a newspaper in a small town in Wyoming, and you get there, and all of a sudden you're thrown into what you think would be a easy job, a tornado of expectations and stress. And so, yeah, some did better than others. Ones who were, collegiate athletes did better with it, and understood what it took. And some were honestly just entitled. They'd never faced that type of intensity or, work. They expected to go home when their work wasn't done, and, thought it was okay not to just get results. And I think there were a few who never did understand that, and I sent them on their way, or they went on their way on their own. But others who did kind of start out that way and then embrace that idea and understood from hopefully the example I was setting and others were setting, that we were, kind of on this bigger mission and wanting to do, great work. I think there was another element of people who did well with that, and that was the people who had worked in high school or in college in restaurants. And in restaurants, it's a really high paced, high pressure, deliver results uh, atmosphere. People may not realize that, but it's, really not a lot of pay, and you can develop some really great teamwork in there. And the people who had worked in restaurants as waiters or waitresses or busboys or cooks, or even they kind of understood it right away, and what it took. So there was just interesting collegiate athletes and people who come from, with restaurant industry experience.
Kelson, give me your good.
I good.
You're
So like
good.
when thinking about this, I was kind of like going back and forth between, there's a difference between like a leader and a mentor, and I always went back to my good experiences from various mentors I had, but I had to like kind of pull it apart a little bit and go back in my past a little ways, and I think one of the best things that a leader did was forced education on me. And it was really for his entire command. He was the commanding officer of a SEAL team, and right before we went on a deployment, he required the entire command to read a specific book. I think it was called The Village. It was a book that was
Bing West.
Vietnam era. That was very applicable to the mission set that we were going to encounter. So he required everyone in our command to read it. And it was big boy rules. He just expected that everyone was going to read it, and like, don't be surprised if he started engaging you on a conversation about it. So that was kind of like his trust but verify, similar to what Rob mentioned. But I think that forced education piece over a huge group was a really good leadership like tactic for that deployment. And some of that kind of carried over for me when I started with my platoon. Of course, I had a lot younger guys that didn't have a lot of money, so what I'd start doing is for Christmas, myself and my platoon commander, we'd get our entire platoon a book for Christmas. Not necessarily forced education piece, but more like we took the time to get you guys a book. Hopefully they would read it. So I think the first Christmas we got them, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, because these guys they're all very like young in their 20s, and they're probably making more money than they had from high school or any other previous job. So we were trying to like bestow some financial wisdom on them through a book. And I think the next book we got him was this book called Fearless, which essentially is the story of Adam Brown. Of course, he was a SEAL that died in Afghanistan, but he has a really good story on his upbringing and like going through a lot of different problems. And he made it to the very like, as far as like NSW tip of the spear, and did really good work. So, and in my mind, that was like probably like the ideal mindset that Adam Brown had. Obviously, I never met him. We were at the same. I think we were both at SEAL Team 2, but he went on to another team. So that was kind of like that's what I took as like essentially like a forced education piece to help develop guys. And I think they appreciated it.
How was when you were forced education piece with the CEO? How was that received, kind of at the unit level? Is there bitching and moaning initially, like, oh, I got to read this fucking book, or was it well received?
I don't think there was bitching and moaning. I I was fairly junior at the time, so I'm like, I'll do anything. I don't give a shit. And it was also like it was a really good deployment that we were about to go on. So I think guys were excited to gain like any kind of little bits of knowledge that they could apply. So yeah, dudes were just hungry and ready to go.
Anything from the book that you were able to apply?
You know, Vietnam and Afghanistan were, fairly different beasts. But I think the mentality of like continuously pushing against the enemy is really what carried over for me, because it was a big deal. The less you do, the more people can encroach on you. So I think it was applicable.
Yeah, that's a great book for anybody who's particularly like junior leaders or just junior guys. Period. Pretty good stuff. I think it was the combined action platoons in Vietnam, and they would go embed pretty deep with within villages, living amongst the local people. Like, very different than a lot of the American experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, where guys were on big bases, although that changed later on. But yeah, the forced education piece is kind of interesting, right? Because I think I guess it depends on the individual, but I think there's sometimes if Kelson and I talked about this previously, but like the most dangerous person in the world is the guy with one deployment, because they think they figured it out, although that's probably almost exclusively not true. And so I think sometimes there can be pushback, right? Like, what do I need to read this book for? I'm a gunslinger, blah blah blah. But I mean, I had several leaders who pushed education on me. I was pretty into that on my own, but I mean, you get something out of that, right? I mean, there's always kind of lessons learned. Learn your history, learn what's worked, what hasn't worked. Kind of gives you a framework.
Yeah, and I think as
ahead.
long as you set guys up for success, right? He wasn't like, hey, go read this book. He was like, here's boxes of this book. I'm giving you the tools. Like, now just spend a week or two educating yourself. So it wasn't. It was very much like in everyone's court to just do it
on their own.
Yeah.
I had mine. And I am highlighting this one because it's just such a contrast to myself. So I'll lay the background because the background story is kind of funny. When I was a platoon commander in the Marines, so you go through a workup. It was a very fast workup, very fast pace. We spent at least 2/3 of our time in the field, getting ready for an Afghan deployment as well. And we kind of do our certifying exercise. That's at the very end of a workup, and we had done really well. I was really proud to be like part of that unit. Really good team that had developed. And so we get out of that certifying exercise, and kind of all the officers and staff NCOs go out to a bar in 29 Palms, California, which is a nothing town in the middle of the desert, if you've ever been there, and proceed to get entirely too fucked up. And it went way off the rails, and there was some pretty gnarly fights, and one guy drove his car. My roommate actually drove his car off the road. He was okay, but left it there. He ended up getting fired. It was a mess. And so there's an investigation into it because it had been such a deal. And the investigating officer is this captain who had checked into the unit like I think literally 2 days before, which is always, that's the problem for anybody checking into a unit, like at the very tail end, because you're the outsider at that point. Like you gotta prove yourself. And so he investigates all of us and interviews all of us, and it's just super by the book, kind of belt fed dude. And it didn't go over well, right? Like there's some arguments and there's some hurt feelings and all that kind of stuff. Anyways, we go on deployment, come back, and everybody does their command handovers and stuff like that. And sure as shit, the new company CO is that investigating officer. So he's got, he's coming into kind of a bad situation. Everybody's holding a grudge against him already from carryovers, and I got moved from platoon commander to XO, so I'm working directly with him as his number 2 guy. So I was not pumped on it, and I had I think natural proclivity against guys who were like the true believers in the Marine Corps. I had I think by nature I'm probably just a little bit more skeptical. I never really bought into like the just by sheer existence the Marine Corps is an elite fighting force. That kind of wasn't my perception. My perception was like it was really based on the team and stuff like that. And I certainly was not a by the book kind of guy. I don't think I would have ever gone into the military had stuff not been going on overseas generally. Anyways, so he takes command, and we ended up building a good relationship. But I mean, he was for sure a true believer, and he and I are friends to this day. And he would tell you that, and it was in such sharp contrast to myself. But he was so consistent with how he approached problems with this, like, not always by the book. He would be willing to bend things, but it was always kind of behind closed doors, right? But he was genuine and he was consistent. And I kind of took something away from that because it turned into, we go through a workup and, your leadership as the CEO gets reflected upon the unit and the performance of the unit. And that unit did really well after having been gutted with personnel, people just getting out or moving units, whatever the case may be, post Afghan deployment, and getting ready for this next deployment, which ended up being a Iraq kind of ISIS, anti-ISIS deal. But I was really impressed by how he approached problems, because it was so significantly different than how I approached things. But it worked, and it worked well. And so I took something away from that in terms of, like, you can be an asshole, but be an asshole consistently, right? Have the expectations laid out and follow up the same way you would day 1 to day 365. And people will respect that, even if there's potentially a personality clash or your approaches are significantly different.
So then, Charlie, when you said like consistent, would he approach an issue with like a calm demeanor and like ponder it for a second, or was like you're saying, was he a consistent asshole, or what made it good?
He was consistently intense and consistently by the book, right? Like, so if you were to take a guy out of the Marine officer manual, like he did that, and he wanted to do that, right? Like that was a choice of his, but he was incredibly consistent in how he did it, which I really learned to respect and in some instances emulate. Like, you can't change your personality, right? That's probably the number one thing you can't do if you're in a leadership position, is like, don't be something you're not. But there were certainly lessons from how he approached it that I kind of took with me forward.
Is what made it good because he was I'm guessing like you're saying he was like predictable in what he was going to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
It's interesting to listen to you guys talk about this, and what about the role of just being competent as a tactical leader in the tactics, in the military stuff? It seems that, especially when we talk about military leadership, there's so much. I mean, I'm not too sure leadership is that freaking complicated. And on the military side, at least the connotation or the way it's presented is that a great military leader is up there giving a rah-rah speech. And it just makes me wonder about the level of competence. So you could have a military leader who, and both of you referred to aspects of leadership that had really little to do with the tactics or the job. Um, and it just is incredible to because the biggest role or the biggest impact your leader can have on you is making sure that he is good at his job in a tactical situation. And because if he isn't, he can get you killed or hurt, or whatever. And it's just interesting that neither of you chose that element of a guy just being really good at his job and not necessarily how he handles personnel stuff, but just the craft of being a soldier or a SEAL or whatever it is. Can you speak to that a little bit? I guess the example I have is we've asked before through our email if you can respect a military leader who is out of shape, and most of the responses were no. But there were a few responses that came back that said, you know what, I had a leader who was kind of fat and chubby or whatever. On a tactical side, it was an army or something like that. That motherfucker, he knew tactics, he knew supply, and he was very, very competent at his job, and it resulted in us having a successful deployment. It seems that so much of military leadership kind of falls back to what you guys talked about, especially you, Kelson, this idea that this leader cares about you to educate you, which is a soft element of leadership, I would think, in the tactics, in the tactical situation. I mean, do military leaders get written up because they care to educate they care about the education of their subordinates? Is that a positive thing, or that they're so, competent that they keep their subordinates, make sure the subordinates are, getting the training they need, making sure their skills are adequate, really thinking about keeping them alive in the field or being successful in the mission. I don't know. Can you speak to that, I guess?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's just as simple as that's an expectation is tactical competency. So it's almost not a differentiator. Like, so if you don't know your tactics, you suck, and you're probably getting fired real fast. So like for me, that's not tactical competency isn't something that is going to raise you above the rest because I expect it of anybody who is in any variety of a leadership role, or just holding a junior guy holding a sector, right? From all levels, like you expect tactical competency. You don't get into those billets generally without it. And if you do somehow manage to get into a job without being tactically competent, you're going to get fired real quick. And you're certainly going to lose your guys like immediately, which I saw happen once, and it was fucking brutal.
Yeah, kind of just to talk a little about something similar to Charlie is like at a team, the expectation from the commanding officer is that all the guys are becoming tactically competent, and how that's being achieved is through not necessarily leadership but mentorship. That's where I think that divide is, because learning how to be a tactical leader I think first comes from mentorship of on like a personal professional development level from um, like enlisted leaders, like creating junior officers and then creating like mid to junior level like enlisted tactical leaders. So I think it's like it's like similar to Charlie said, it's an expectation.
Well, you guys say that, but I mean, there was a book written a few years ago. I think it was called The Generals or something, talking about the incompetency of the U.S. leadership in Iraq and Iran, or Iraq and Afghanistan, um, and the idea that there was some, or you hear this on there often now that no one's been fired for the Afghanistan pullout and how that happened. And it was just talking about how, leader after leader, just utterly failed. And it just didn't do a good job. And this author compared these roles or the performance of the senior leadership in the U.S. military during our war on terrorism with Civil War and World War II, where, I mean, tactical competency and results on the battlefield were everything. Um, and it was fairly quick, which senior leadership demonstrated that and were, promoted, and then the ones who didn't were quickly, reassigned and cut back. And it just seems that there's a disconnect with with the ideal or the admiral or the general, and in front of a bunch of people with his chest all full of jewelry, talking about motivation and what happened in the field where, the tactics can certainly be questioned. I know that's just something that comes up. It seems that there's a lot of discussion in the focus in the military on leadership, and it always comes back to, caring for your guys, consistency, yada, 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 but never have I seen that you need to be super, super competent. It's just an interesting idea. I just wonder where that comes from. I mean, recently, the Army instigated a course for prospective battalion commanders where they have to go and they have to pass this course. But we print in our RET all the time, battalion commanders who are getting fired for this and that. Anyway, it's just an interesting point. I was surprised not to see you talk about that. I guess answer back to you, Charlie, is it that obvious? I mean, maybe we just haven't had a full scale conflict in so many years that we don't know. But is it that obvious that or accepted, or that every company commander is a great tactician? I'm just not so sure. It seems that there's a lot of misspent energy talking about leadership and motivation when, I worked with, I'll give you an example. We one time offered up to teach range fitness for free, and wanted to test our shooting under stress system. And, most of the people who applied were special forces or units, special units, law enforcement, and military, like, MARSOC and FBI SWAT and stuff. But there was one young captain, a captain on, I think it was just the 82nd Airborne, just on brag. And this guy had to lift heaven and earth to get us there. It was a fight to get ammo, it was a fight to get the friggin' range opened, yada, yada, yada. It's such a nightmare just to train tactics. And this guy made it happen. And it seemed to me that, or in this case, shooting under stress, which seems to be pretty important if you're in the military, you're going to be deployed. And it was just interesting to me to see that this guy was seriously interested in his soldiers' ability to shoot under stress and survive, honestly. And I just hadn't seen that. It was rare to see that. I'll shut up now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely is an expectation of competency, or else you got fired. And I saw a lot of guys, not a lot, but I saw guys on the officer side get fired for not being competent. I think there's certainly like a the higher up you go, the harder it is to get fired. There's something to that, which, kind of relates back to the general's book, right? Like nobody in Afghanistan got fired. I'm sure there's lots of political stuff associated with that, and it's a bad look to fire. If you're the Secretary of Defense or President, it's a bad look to fire somebody unless they do something that is a PR nightmare, like Petraeus did. But yeah, I mean, I saw lots of guys get fired, and I think almost certainly tactical competency is an expectation when you go into a command build. And if you're not performing, you're going to get hammered really fast. There's not much patience for lack of tactical competency. Any thoughts on that one, Kelson?
I mean, from my experience, when you get to command level, well, essentially any kind of milestone that you're filling from like E7 and up, it's such a screening process to get that position that often you're not gonna get fired unless you break some kind of law or you screw up really bad. Just I guess where I'm going with this is their ability to find quality people is very scrutinized, and yeah, from where I come from, not a whole lot of guys get fired once they get to that level.
Do you think, are there guys you would say he probably should have been fired for tactical incompetency specifically? We don't have to dive too deep into this one.
Yeah, not that I can put my finger on. But there's also the aspect of, not everyone knows the whole story. So some of the times sometimes you just have to put faith in like the correct decision is being made and you don't know the whole story. That might sound like a cop out answer, but like there's times to where I've armchair quarterback some shit and then found out some details afterwards and I just looked like a complete dipshit. So
all right, you want to go into bad? I'll start this one off. So I had a squad leader who was a fairly senior sergeant, had definitely been around the block, good amount of combat experience, stuff like that, had done well throughout the workup. But there was a relationship that he had that was toxic, to say the least. And so we deployed, and we're holding our own security at our location and all that kind of good stuff. And there's what they call a sergeant of the guard. So basically the guy who's going to be making the rounds of inspections along with the corporal of the guard. And so that's kind of their job, right, is to float around, make sure guys are doing the right things, make sure they're staying attention. There's probably no worse job in the world than standing post. You're just staring out into the abyss all night long under nods. And he had been having some issues, and I go, inspect what you expect, right? I go out to go see where he's at and see what the guys are up to, and he's nowhere to be found. And I end up finding him on like a MWR phone, talking with his significant other, and so not where he needed to be, in a pretty dramatic way. And I flipped my shit and like lost my temper. Not good, not what you need, right? And especially after talking about like consistency, like he was going to get fired either way, but the way I did it, I lost my temper, and wasn't consistent there, and it really was a bad deal. And there was some background stuff behind that. You know, we had done a lot to try and take care of him, and it was, you know, this was like, what the fuck, you know, do all these things and you're not getting it there. But, you know, the dude had some issues, right? And I shouldn't have lost my temper in the way that I did. I still feel shitty about, you know, my own performance in that instance because I lost my temper to the degree that I did. Rob, you want to hit yours?
Yeah, when I was after like 5 or 6, a few years in the newspaper business, I hired an editor, one of my reporters, and he's having problems with one of our photographers, and he came to me and said he wanted to let this person go, and I just agreed with him. I didn't really question it. I just trusted him, and so I ended up firing this young photographer, and it was such a serious mistake, such a righteous dickhead move on my part, not to go in there and find out what was going on, to trust this person, the editor, to see if we could, bring up the performance or whatever's going on. And to this day, I regret it and not being slower there and thinking that through. Yeah, I feel really bad about it. It was really, really an immature, righteous move on my part. And would have cost nothing to figure it out, go in there, see what we could do, bring the performance up, whatever it took. Could have just been a friggin', personality conflict for all I know. But I didn't do that. I was just, I don't know if I was lazy or I don't know what it was. But in hindsight, I really regret that. And I wish I hadn't done it. It was just and I've had several leadership mistakes, but that's the one that really stands out. How quickly I acted and just really how unfair I was and how wrong I was not to try to fix it instead of just cut this kid loose. He was just a kid, and it was just, I don't know. I really feel bad about it to this day.
At what point did you know that was a mistake?
Like fucking immediately after it happened, I was like, what did I? And I was too proud to go in there and try to fix it, right? Which is lays upon the, lays upon the, you know, the, the issue I had. I was too proud to go in there and try to fix it after I made a mistake. I was like, didn't want to look bad or I don't know what it was, but and I wasn't. I was in my 30s now. I was a grown ass man. It was just a wrong thing to do. I should have known better, and I should have done better. And I really have to watch, that I don't know, just to be really careful with that. And since then, I've been hopefully a lot more, careful about moving somebody on. Sometimes stuff just doesn't work, but I do know that there have been people who I've moved on since then, and to a person that's been, they kind of knew it was time to go. They said, yeah, it was time to go. So, but yeah, I think in this case, I knew right away. And again, I was too proud or too immature or too lazy, or whatever it was, to go in there and fix it. I should have done that too.
Kelson?
Oh yeah, I've got some good mistakes, but I'll just talk about one. And I'm gonna kind of like skirt around some details because I don't like what I'm gonna talk about. I don't necessarily want to like expose like who it has to deal to do with. But essentially like so I'm leading a small group of guys, right? And I'm spending I spent 3 years with these guys, so I know them all really good. And I kind of always prided myself in really, having a good understanding of everyone's family, what is like going on with everyone. Until one of my guys gets a DUI, and like in the, kind of like in the military world, you're, as like a small unit leader, you're responsible for like stuff that your guys do inside and outside of work. So, um, that, that was kind of it. It was a little bit of my mistake that he got a DUI. I mean, granted, like he took the action and he did it, but there was definitely, like, looking back on it now, and actually I shouldn't say now. I mean, a few years ago, and I keep thinking about it, is like there was like telltale signs that were there that I should have questioned, but um, I don't know if I didn't question them because of like I was too busy, or maybe it's just the culture of the military. One of the signs, right, is like he got a DUI. He, you know, potential alcohol problems, but like when I think about it, and when I was always with him, like he was always drinking like the highest alcohol content beer. Like that's what he was always like looking for. Them like maybe he's thinking back on it now. I'm like maybe he's just trying to like get somewhere quicker than everyone else. As in like drunk or a buzz or something like that. I think about like maybe some of the family things I knew he had going on, and uh, maybe that was influencing some of his decisions because he was stressed out. He was in a tough place. So I think the signs were there. I just didn't act on it, and I just wasn't intrusive enough. And it like, yeah, even still to this day, it really fucking pisses me off. I should have questioned and dug into his life a little more, and I think I probably could have, prevented that situation. So, um, but it was an unfortunate learning point for me, but I think everything's going to work out.
Did it change anything in terms of how you approached guys' problem, particularly like personal life? That's like if you haven't been in the military, it's hard to understand like the degree to which you are accountable for the actions of your guys outside of work. I mean, it's like there is no difference, right? You're getting held accountable for that, and they're certainly getting held accountable for it from a career perspective. It's a challenging dynamic.
Yeah. So to answer your question, Charlie, after that, I I became a lot more blunt with guys, and half of it is just like asking the hard questions that guys typically don't want to avoid. But if you just like shotgun them with it and get it out there, it, at least you put the question out there, you asked it, you gave them the opportunity, and also like a lot of that opportunity can be helpful for those guys, because once you ask, it gives them the freedom to talk about it. So, especially if they didn't want to.
Yeah.
So,
All right. Any other questions or comments, guys?
I guess it's interesting just the drinking culture in the military, and of course I was in the '90s and it was certainly there. How big of it is it now, where with your guys you go out and get hammered on Friday or whatever? Is that still happening?
I mean, I've been out
yeah,
for a long time, but I would assume yes.
yeah, I think the culture's still there. I think what it is people hanging out with each other, and as a team, and the drinking is the subset of that. But as you get older, you want to drink less, so because you got to perform.
Right. Yeah, interesting.
All right. Well, let's leave it there. Until next time, thanks for listening in.